Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at a really profound contradiction. How can a country, the Central African Republic, I mean, it's right there at the very heart of Africa.
Yeah, geographically central.
Exactly. And it's rich in resources, diamonds, gold, timber, you name it. But it consistently ranks among the world's poorest nations.
It's jarring.
Yeah, we're talking about a place where life expectancy is, what, barely over 50 years? 50.6 years.
That's right.
And GDP per capita, back in 2012 anyway, was just $451.
Yeah.
It's this huge paradox we want to dive into today.
It truly is a stark reality, and our mission really in this deep dive is to unpack the incredibly turbulent, very complex history of the Central African Republic, the CIR.
Okay.
We want to trace its journey, from pre-colonial times right through French colonial rule.
Right.
It's a very tumultuous independence, and then this devastating cycle of conflict that just seems to keep going.
So trying to understand why this resource-rich place is just a constant battleground. Mercenaries, rebels, government soldiers.
Precisely. And exploring this persistent absence of legitimate governance ever since independence from France back in 1960.
Okay.
So we'll be distilling the key insights from our source material, aiming to give you a clear, comprehensive picture.
Great. So to really get a handle on this, I guess we need to start with the basics. The geography, the land itself. Where exactly is CIR? And why does its location matter so much?
Well, like you said, it's literally the heart of Africa. It's landlocked.
Right, no coast.
No coast. Bordered by Chad, Sudan, South Sudan now, the DRC, Republic of the Congo, Cameroon. It's surrounded.
A tough neighborhood in some ways.
In many ways, yes. And the landscape itself varies quite a bit. You've got dense forests in the south, part of the Congo Basin, then it moves into sort of savanna in the north. And it has major rivers like the Ubangi, which is a huge transport artery, or at least should be.
So vital waterways, but landlocked. And then this paradox we kicked off with rich in resources, yet deeply poor. How does the land itself, what's under the ground, play into this story?
That's where this idea of the resource curse really hits home for Sahar. It's not just a theory here.
Is real.
It's devastatingly real. Our sources are clear. This incredible wealth, diamonds, gold, uranium, timber, it hasn't built the nation.
No.
Instead, it's often become a direct driver of conflict.
Fueling the fighting.
Exactly. It gets siphoned off by elites, sometimes with, foreign backing. It funds militias. It fuels the very instability that prevents any kind of real development.
So it's a vicious cycle. The wealth actually causes the poverty and violence in a way.
It's a feedback loop, yeah. The abundance guarantees the suffering, ironically.
Okay, so to understand how a country gets trapped like this, we need to look back. What was life like before the colonial powers arrived? What are the pre-colonial roots?
Well, historically, the area was home to relatively small groups of hunter-gatherers, fairly scattered populations.
Sustainable living, mostly.
Largely, yes. Things started to change around the 15th century, though, with Portuguese traders arriving.
Okay, what were they after?
Initially, ivory and wild ruger, early trade routes being established, that sort of thing.
And I suppose other European powers got interested. France, specifically.
Yes, France came onto the scene later, particularly with expeditions like Jean-Baptiste Marchal's in 1874. That sort of laid the groundwork for French influence, then protectorates.
And it wasn't exactly a peaceful takeover, was it?
No, not at all. By the late 19th, early 20th century, France was consolidating control. And our sources mention the slave trade was already part of the landscape then.
Locals being treated for goods?
For arms, for alcohol, yes. It was a brutal reality even as French power grew. Their policy actually shifted from trying peaceful annexation to outright military expeditions.
To secure control.
Secure control, capture arms, capture slaves, and importantly, monopolize the ivory trade, which was hugely lucrative.
Right.
By 1914, they'd pretty much completed the conquest. They called the territory Ubangi Shari.
And Ubangi Shari then became part of a larger French colonial structure.
That's right. By 1910, it was incorporated into French Equatorial Africa, administered all the way from Brazzaville down in Congo.
And the main French interest was?
Purely economic exploitation, essentially. Cotton was big for French textile mills and minerals. They knew there were resources, though maybe not the full extent, but the focus was extraction.
So this pattern of wealth flowing outwards, not benefiting the local people, it starts way back then.
Absolutely. It sets the stage for everything that follows, including that resource curse we talked about.
Okay, fast forward to 1960. Independence arrives. But you hinted earlier it was maybe independence in name only. How much influence did France keep?
A huge amount. That's the crucial point. CRR gained sovereignty but remained heavily under French political and economic sway.
How did that work?
Well, French foreign policy consistently backed leaders who were, let's say, friendly to French interests.
Ah, right.
Protecting French companies, state-owned firms operating there. And they kept a military presence in the region too, always nearby.
And what about the new Central African leaders themselves? Were they ready for independence?
That's the other key factor. Our sources are pretty blunt. The nationalist leaders were largely unprepared for nation building.
Why was that?
There'd been almost no groundwork laid by the French, no development of local political parties, no functioning administration to take over, no properly trained military.
Just a vacuum, basically.
A vacuum, exactly. And that vacuum really set the stage for the chronic instability that came next.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That lack of preparation. Was CAR unique in that, or was this common across newly independent Africa?
Well, many faced challenges, certainly, but the degree of unpreparedness, the lack of foundational structures in CR seems particularly acute, according to our sources.
And that allowed instability to set in really quickly.
Almost immediately. David Dacko, the first president, even with French backing, his grip on power was described as tenuous.
Okay.
His rule involved suppressing rivals, cracking down hard, and tragically, our sources mention a massacre of the educated elite.
Wow. So wiping out potential future leaders or administrators.
Precisely. It just hollowed out the country's capacity even further.
And Dacko had this. Well, the sources call it a naive approach to keeping the people happy. Festivals and safaris.
Yeah, endless schemes of festival and safari. That's the quote. It sounds almost bizarre.
Instead of building schools or roads?
Instead of fundamental reforms, yeah. Offering spectacles to distract from the grinding poverty and lack of governance.
And education itself was in a terrible state.
Dire. Linguistic chaos, different languages used inconsistently in schools, and in rural areas, something like 99% illiteracy, just staggering.
So fertile ground for more upheaval. Which brings us to Jean-Bertrand Bokassa, Dacko's nephew, right?
That's him. Overthrew Dacko in a coup, declared himself president for life.
And then emperor.
And then Emperor Bokassa I, yes. Turned the country into the Central African Empire.
His rule was notoriously extravagant. How was that funded?
Largely by France, ironically. They propped him up for years.
Why? What was in it for France?
Well, access to resources, geopolitical influence. But eventually, even France found him too much. His rule became essentially subservient to French interests anyway.
And then the cycle repeated. Dacko came back.
Yes. Bokassa was overthrown with French help, again, and Dacko was put back in power.
Unbelievable.
Only to be ousted himself a couple years later by General André Kolimba.
It's just coup after coup.
It's a relentless pattern described in the sources. Protests, armed uprisings like against Kolimba, often met with force, sometimes French force stepping in to pacify things.
So even though there might have been older traditional systems of governance post-independence, AR never found its feet.
Never. The sources say it's been fraught with coup d'etat, civil wars, and unrest. Stability, democracy, they never really took root. That initial lack of foundation just kept haunting it.
And this cycle seemed to reach a new horrific intensity around 2013. What triggered that major flare-up?
That's when the Séléka rebels, a coalition, mostly Muslim fighters, swept down from the north and captured Bangui, the capital, in March 2013.
And they weren't just a political force.
No, they quickly degenerated into, well, armed militias, responsible for what the sources call mass killings, sexual violence, and the blatant and chaotic looting of property.
Yeah.
Just terrorizing the population.
And that provoked a backlash.
It did. In response, militias calling themselves the Anti-Balaka, mostly Christian, rose up.
So it became sectarian.
It certainly took on that dimension. The violence escalated dramatically, targeting communities based on religion. Millions were displaced. It was catastrophic.
But you mentioned something interesting earlier, that initially the conflict wasn't primarily framed in ethnic or religious terms by the main players.
That's a really crucial point from our sources, yeah. Unlike many conflicts, the leaders, the main actors, rarely use defiant ethnic-based rhetoric to mobilize support, right at the start.
Huh.
But the narrative, the way it was talked about, and certainly how it played out on the ground with the militias, quickly became sectarian. The portrayal shifted towards an ethnic or religious conflict.
So if it wasn't purely ethnic hatred driving it from the top, What were the core reasons for that 2013 explosion, according to the analysis?
The argument in our material is that it's less about simple ethnic division and more about a domestic power struggle among elites.
Elites fighting each other.
Yes, using external connections, informal networks, whatever they could. Two things came together.
Okay.
First, you had political elites using exclusion and repression against their rivals, pushing people out, cracking down.
Standard power politics, maybe, but extreme.
Very extreme in this context. And second, you had foreign actors, states, maybe corporations, others trying to exploit Caire's weakness, using the chaos, the state incapacity, to further their own advantage globally.
And resources played a role again.
Directly. Diamonds, for instance, no longer being properly exploited for the country's benefit. Forest revenues, just stolen by political elites. It all feeds the conflict, funds the fighting, exacerbates the whole crisis.
And the result on the ground, away from the capital, just chaos.
Yes, pretty much. Outside the main cities, the sources paint a picture of near-total lawlessness. Outlaw gangs freely commit pillage, murder, and arson.
With no effective police or courts.
Often completely incapable of stopping it, a real collapse of the rule of law in vast parts of the country.
Given this chaos and Caire's position,
Yeah.
surrounded by other unstable areas.
Like DRC, Sudan, South Sudan. Yeah.
The international community must have taken notice.
Oh, absolutely. Its strategic location alone meant its collapse couldn't be ignored. It aroused important political and diplomatic mobilization, as the sources put it.
So help arrived. What form did that take?
It was multifaceted. You had emergency humanitarian aid pouring in.
Okay.
African Union troops were deployed, then UN peacekeepers, MINUSCA. The EU got involved too. A whole range of international actors stepped in.
But I think you mentioned the goals of this intervention shifted.
Yes, quite significantly. Initially, it was pure crisis response, saving lives, emergency mode. But then the focus broadened. It moved towards post-conflict recovery, which sounds good, but it meant a more technocratic and policy-driven approach.
Linking aid to bigger development goals.
Exactly, linking humanitarian aid to broader economic and political reforms, which, has pros and cons.
But this international response wasn't exactly seamless, was it? You mentioned fragmentation.
That's a major criticism in the sources. The international effort was marked by unprecedented fragmentation and incoherence.
Meaning too many cooks?
Too many different actors, states, NGOs, international organizations, often working in parallel, sometimes with different agendas, not coordinating properly.
And that caused problems.
Yes, sometimes it actually made things worse on the ground.
Yeah.
Aggravated local tensions or dynamics.
And it raises that fundamental question, doesn't it? Why were these foreign actors really there?
Exactly. Our sources ask bluntly, were they genuinely seeking peace, or were they primarily serving their own interests? Geopolitical, economic, whatever.
That must have complicated things for humanitarian groups just trying to deliver aid.
Hugely. When aid gets inextricably linked with these broader political and economic agendas, it really challenges the ability of humanitarian organizations to stay neutral, to get access based purely on need. It muddies the waters.
We've painted this grim picture about political chaos, cycles of violence, resource exploitation, a complicated international response. What does this actually mean for the people living there and for the environment itself?
The cost is just immense on every level. It connects back to everything we've discussed.
How so?
Well, think about it. The lawlessness, the weak state, it means healthcare is rudimentary at best for most people.
Right.
Education is crippled, and sheer desperation drives things like rapid deforestation, people needing charcoal, needing land, which in turn destroys Hall's incredible natural heritage.
And that deforestation or resource grabbing might even fund the conflict.
Often directly, yes. It's all interconnected in this really destructive way.
You mentioned this concept of duality in Kill Society. Can you expand on that? It sounds key to understanding daily life.
It really is. What the sources describe is the split. On one hand, you have pockets, mostly the capital, Bangui, maybe a few other towns where people are somewhat connected.
To the outside world, to the government.
To global trade, international aid, the official state, yes. But then you have these vast rural areas.
Where the government doesn't reach.
Pretty much. Where life is governed by different rules. Local customs, maybe traditional leaders, sometimes warlords or armed groups. The national law just doesn't apply or isn't enforced.
That must make everything incredibly difficult. Justice, services.
Everything. How do you access healthcare? How do you get educated? Who do you turn to if you're robbed? It fractures the country. It undermines any sense of a unified nation.
And so essential services like healthcare and education just crumble in that reality.
They really struggle. Healthcare is mostly basic, primary care. Lots of people rely on traditional healers.
Active doctors.
A dire shortage of qualified staff, is how the sources put it, plus low pay. And since the 90s, people often have to pay user fees, which many just can't afford.
And education.
Similar problems. Lack of resources, lack of trained teachers, no consistent curriculum across the country. Our sources talk about a lack of shared knowledge, even about how to operate in conflict zones.
It sounds like a fundamental failure of the state post-independence.
Some sources explicitly link it to the failure of decolonization, showing how local governance either just gives way to external forces or remains totally inadequate.
And amidst all this human suffering, CR's environment is also paying a heavy price. It has amazing wildlife, right?
Incredible biodiversity, African elephants, white rhinos, critically endangered, even the okapi, which is incredibly rare.
That they're threatened.
Severely. Rapid deforestation and exploitation, the sources say. Cutting down forests for farmland, for charcoal production, it's destroying habitats at an alarming rate.
Are there efforts to protect it?
Yes, there are. The National Parks Agency exists, trying to protect reserves. There's also a growing focus on involving indigenous communities.
Why them specifically?
Because they often have deep local knowledge and sustainable practices. The sources mention their pragmatism, resourcefulness, and confidence, empowering them to help manage and protect wildlife.
But does the environment also get caught up in the international interests?
It seems so. Our sources point out that at least two of the so-called big powers have intervened specifically to profit from CAR's natural resources. So the environmental destruction is linked back to those external actors and the resource curse again.
Okay, so moving towards the present day, despite this incredibly difficult history, there have been attempts to stabilize things politically. Faustin Archange Touadera was elected president in 2016. What's the situation now? Is the fighting over?
No, unfortunately not entirely over. The struggles definitely persist. You've got former President Bouazizi still active, stirring things up, renewed threats from some ex-Séléka factions. It's still fragile.
But there is a government structure in place.
Technically, yes. It's a multi-party presidential republic on paper. The current majority party is the Union for the Reconstruction of the Republic, URCA.
URCA. And they have a particular approach.
They talk about generative governance.
Generative governance. What does that actually mean in a context like CARER's?
Well, as the sources describe it, it seems to be about trying to build governance from the bottom up, empowering local communities.
Instead of just top-down from Bangweed.
Exactly. There's an emphasis on local democratic assemblies, trying to bridge that duality we talked about, giving rural populations who've been cut off more of a stake, more agency.
Trying to build legitimacy from the grassroots.
That seems to be the idea. An attempt to finally build stability from within, rather than just relying on central control or external actors.
That sounds like a really important shift in thinking, potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
But let's be realistic. Even with these efforts and ongoing international aid, the deep problems haven't vanished, have they? Corruption, mismanagement.
Oh, absolutely not. Those issues are deeply entrenched.
Yeah.
Corruption, gross mismanagement, a real lack of accountability, these remain massive obstacles. The path ahead is still incredibly challenging for CAR.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've really dived deep into the Central African Republic today, and it reveals this nation just buckling under the weight of its history, colonialism, the resource curse, these endless internal power fights, and then this fragmented, sometimes unhelpful international response.
It's a heavy burden, but amidst it all, you also see incredible human resilience, people surviving against unimaginable odds.
Absolutely. And what really strikes me, what stands out to you perhaps, is how CAR's story isn't just about CAR, is it?
No, not at all. It feels like a microcosm, in a way.
Yeah.
A really stark example of the challenges so many post-colonial states face. That complex tangle of history, resources, bad governance, and global interests playing out.
It really makes you think. So what's the takeaway for the future? I was struck by this quote in our source material, describing the Central African state as invented in haste, lacking any real foundation, likened to a vast and barren eagle-sprouting rock, where these imported clockwork models tried to mimic the motions of the great eagles. Only the outside mechanics have been succeeded.
It's a powerful, almost poetic image, haunting.
It really is. And it leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? Can a nation truly take flight, truly soar when its very foundations, its mechanics, are so deeply shaped, maybe even broken, by outside forces in its own history?
What would it actually take?
Yeah. What would it genuinely take for CIR to build its own wings? Something for all of us to think about.